Do not drink from the waters of Lethe. A Trip to the Underworld by Júlia Rosell Saldaña. Prologue. It doesn't take long for us humans to meet death in person. Around us there is always someone or something that dies. Its existence vanishes before us, leaving behind a decaying shell of flesh. Religion teaches us that life goes on in another way, and, depending on the culture, it can be in many ways. Our resistance makes us run in the opposite direction to death, without realizing that in reality we run in circles and one way or another we will end our path in front of death itself. The different cultures of the world have always given a meaning to the journey to the underworld, about which they have given details and even help on how to reach peace and an existence very different from the one we live in these sacks of meat called bodies. Some speak of a journey full of tests, others of crossing immense rivers, others speak of days of learning about the new state, others speak of the departure of the soul from the wheel of samsara or forced reincarnation. There are as many stories about death as there are cultures the world has, some of them already extinct. In this story, we are going to go on a long journey through the different views on death of the very diverse cultures of the world. Introduction. I was bedridden. It was my last moments. My body was working worse, and I was losing faculties every minute. I started losing my sight and touch. I couldn't speak anymore. My sense of hearing was the last I had operational, and I could perfectly hear my loved ones, who were around me in bed. Every time they said something to me, I made an effort to smile so they could see that I wasn't suffering. I was just dying. Who knows if it was because of the liberation that was getting rid of the body or because of the biochemical dance caused by the brain, I felt a lot of peace. There came a time when I saw a light that radiated peace and happiness and tried to pull me. At that moment, I remembered the words of a friend who told me not to go to the light because the only thing I would achieve is being trapped by entities that only wanted to deceive me with lies. I had to make an enormous effort as that light attracted me, like a vacuum cleaner sucks up dust. But after a while of struggling with that light, it gave up and disappeared. When I realized it, I was floating above my body and my loved ones were crying to me. I knew they couldn't hear me, but somehow I tried to convey to them that it was all over and I was fine. As time progressed, a time different from that of the clocks, a being made up of wings and several eyes appeared and came to ask me why I did not go to the light. I told him what a friend had told me, and he was surprised. He then introduced himself as a cherub and told me to please follow him. The underworlds. Kur. We walked for hours through absolute blackness that was only partially dissipated, and in a small space by the cherub. In the background, we saw what looked like caves with strange buildings and a huge number of people. Or failing that, their souls. We tried to get through the crowd while every few meters we passed through a door. We count 7 gates until we reach a palace. In that palace, we saw a throne occupied by a woman with wings, eagle claws for feet, and when she noticed us, she asked us the reason for our presence. The cherub, friendly and diplomatic, informed Ereshkigal, queen of that subterranean kingdom where the souls of the dead resided, that we were on a journey to learn more about what happened after death. The queen showed no interest, but she had one of her henchmen come to tell us what the souls were doing there. They ate a dry powder and drank what their descendants sent them through their tombs, so they wouldn't suffer from thirst. We were able to verify that those resident souls in Kur simply based their existence on wandering around, eating and drinking. When we understood the functioning of that underworld, we set off in search of others. Duat. We left Kur in that unreal plane where the logic and physics of the living did not make sense to search for other underworlds. After hours of searching, we came to a large gate inscribed with Egyptian hieroglyphics. The cherub strove to open the doors for me, and inside we saw how gods, demons, and souls coexisted, waiting to be judged and put to the test. My companion explained to me that after death, the Egyptians were put to the test by demons at the orders of the gods to check if the souls of the deceased had a right to the hereafter. The most important test was, After overcoming the demonic challenges, weighing the heart of the deceased and an ostrich feather on a scale. If the heart outweighed the feather, the soul was eaten by Amit, the eater of souls, and denied a life in the afterlife. On the contrary, those with a heart lighter than an ostrich feather were allowed to continue their journey to Aru, a kind of paradise. The journey to Aru was dangerous, and the soul of the deceased still had to pass many more tests. We were approached by one of those demons ordered by the gods who made us tour guide. We climbed to an elevated position from where he showed us the 5 ghats that led to the final test of the scales. Each door was guarded by a demon who gave the test instructions to the souls who wanted to live in the hereafter. I was starting to get thirsty, and I asked that demon if he could get me something to drink. Very kindly, he served me a delicious liquor that quenched my thirst, and when I finished drinking, we thanked him for his guidance and left. Naraka. In our journey through the dark and empty worlds of the dead, we came to an immense land where worlds and subworlds could be seen intermingling. A strange humanoid being appeared to us as a messenger from King Yama, god of death, and questioned us about the reasons for being in his domain. We explained to him that we were travelling through the underworlds, trying to understand what awaited the dead after their vital itinerary. That being, called Yamaduta, ordered us to follow him. When we advanced enough, we could count up to 28 different hells, and in the centre of those hells a huge palace made entirely of jade. As we got closer, we could see how demonic beings typical of the Hindu culture were dedicated to the torture of souls. The Yamaduta told us that each sin had its punishment, and it was the objective of the demons to cleanse the karmic debt of the souls so that they could incarnate again and continue their existence in the wheel of samsara. We kept walking until we reached the entrance to the Jade Palace, where a huge line of souls was waiting to be judged by King Yama. That image reminded me more of the queues in the world of the living for the tax agency or the DGT. Thanks to the Yamaduta, we were able to skip the queue and go directly to meet King Yama. This being, who was colossal, was sitting in a chair in front of a huge desk covered with paperwork. When he saw the 3 of us appear, he became furious and demanded explanations from Yamaduta for the interruption of his work. Our guide explained that we were visiting to see the underworlds. With that explanation, King Yama calmed down and made me go up to the table through some stairs that were on the side of the table. This table was raised about 20 meters above ground level. When I got to the top, the cherub was waiting for me there, and King Yama lowered one of his hands for us to climb on. When we did, he placed us on his right shoulder and continued with his work. From what we saw, the king dedicated himself to judging all the dead, whether people or animals, based on the karmic or dharmic debt they had. Only the pure and virtuous were spared judgment and could go directly to the Svarga, a kind of paradise for good souls. As ridiculous as it may seem, I understood that King Yama had such a bad mood, he had to listen to excuses and cries from the damned, who were taken to the different hells in order to tear out all evil in their souls and rectify the karmic debt they had. After hours of hellish bureaucracy, King Yama gave us a banquet with the best foods, took a break from his work, and focused on explaining in detail those 28 hells that were under his control. When we finished, we thanked him for the stay and left in search of other underworlds. DU. The journey continued until we reached a beautiful land reminiscent of rural China on one side and the Chinese imperial capital of Beijing on the other. A highly bureaucratized air was breathed there. At our entrance to those lands, we were welcomed by a minor god, who, as his peers from other underworlds did on other occasions, introduced himself to us and ordered us to explain the reason for our visit. His kindness and courtesy made the previous guides look ridiculous, as he immediately praised us and offered us food and drinks. When we finished, he took us to a great palace where the court of the Yama kings was, which he told us had been chosen by the Jade King, the main and creator deity, to control the affairs of this subterranean world. On one of the walls of the palace we could see how the 18 hells, to which the souls of the deceased went, as in the Naraka, were explained, to be subjected to torture and punishment until they were cleansed of sin and karma. Our guide explained to us that as humanity advanced and new sins appeared, new hells were formed to deal with those matters. He also told us that there was a space dedicated to those souls who had committed crimes for which there was no punishment yet. He also told us that there were actually more than 134 hells, but they lightened the maps and names for convenience. That place was tremendously hierarchical and bureaucratized and could be seen by the number of parchments and books on the walls. Within that palace there were 10 heavenly courts, each of which focused on the judgment of certain sins. And it is where the punishments and tortures prior to the reincarnation of the souls of the deceased were assigned. As in the Naraka, the stay in these hells was not eternal, and everything depended on how many sins had to be cleansed from the souls before they could reincarnate. After the explanations, our guide took us to meet Yanwang, the Supreme King of DU, and in charge of making the final decisions about the souls of the dead. He invited us, as seemed to be the custom for Asians, to a banquet at which the topic of conversation was the many tortures and the Jade King's charge to purify the souls to allow them to return to Earth to finish their apprenticeship. After eating and drinking, we thanked King Yanwang for his hospitality and withdrew with a formal bow to continue our journey. Hades. Our journey continued until we reached the bank of a huge, violent, and impassable river. The bank of said river was full of souls of death that wandered from one side to the other, while it was seen that some souls were trapped under the water. Other souls seemed to be so thirsty that they drank from a smaller and less violent river that I had placed to the right of the great river that appeared before us. I approached to drink, but the cherub pushed me and stopped me, told me that I should not drink from that river, called Lethe, because I would forget everything that was and had been and would be like an empty shell. We approached the bank of the great river, where a boatman approached us. He introduced himself as Charon and offered us to cross the river in exchange for a silver coin. Cherub made a coin appear out of nowhere and handed it to the ferryman, who let us board his barge and set out on our journey down that mighty river. During our trip, we could see how the hands of some deceased protruded from the waters, hoping to grab something and be able to get out of there, while from afar we saw that the shore from which we had started was full of wandering souls that went up and down the course from the river. After a few hours, we reached the other shore where Charon disembarked us, and we were grateful for the trip. In front of us, there was a huge wall, which the cherub told me was the wall of Erebos, impassable and impossible to overcome. We looked for a passage through the wall, and when we found it, a huge 3-headed dog came out of nowhere and growled at us. The cherub tried to calm him down, and when he succeeded, he pointed out some souls that were trying to escape through the path, guarded by said dog. He lunged for them and put them back in the fold behind the wall of Erebos. Seeing that the dog was busy, we continued our march towards a pavilion that could be seen in the distance. Along the way, we could see how long lines of souls gathered to go in that direction. Cherub told me that this pavilion was the Pavilion of Judgment, where King Minos judged the souls of the deceased to decide where they should go in the underworld. We approached and entered the pavilion, where that imposing King Minos, who looked like a giant, analysed soul by soul and decided in pursuit of certain conditions. Unholy souls who had acted cruelly and committed serious crimes were sent to the fields of punishment, where they were tortured in the cruelest ways until their next incarnation. The truly horrendous, devious souls whose punishment was not enough were sent to Tartarus, where the enemies of the gods were held prisoner. Neutral souls, that is, those who did not stand out for good or evil in their lives, were sent directly to the asphodel fields. Before being able to enter, they were forced to drink from the river Lethe, so that they would forget their being and prepare to incarnate again in life under a new identity. The pure and good souls, or those who performed heroic acts, were sent to Elysium, where they could live in a paradisiacal zone and continue to exist at will until their own incarnation. Those who had visited Elysium 3 times in a row after 3 lives were sent to the Isles of the Blessed, where they could enjoy a peaceful existence of eternal happiness. After the explanations of the cherub and seeing King Minos in action, we decided to go to the Palace of Hades. That enormous palace that was reminiscent of the architecture of classical Greece was imposing, but we couldn't get in, so we had to go back the way we had come, pay Sharon again and return to the eternal darkness between the underworlds. Recapitulation. After that trip, I realized that each culture had its own representation of redemption. Despite continuing to exist in non-existence after death, I had not found my place. Surely along the way we left some underworlds to visit, but seeing that they all had something in common, it helped me to get an idea of what death was, or, in any case, the afterlife process. Together with my guide, we set off looking for more information about death. If I had managed to avoid that light or those underworlds, it was clear that there must be many more like me in those parts. An apart world. A city of dead. We walked until we reached a point where a floor appeared again. We were no longer in that eternal darkness where all those underworlds were somehow stored and interconnected. Strange trees with their tops full of a strange ectoplasm surrounded us while the grass we stepped on was pale and sticky. We continued walking through that strange place without sky until we saw a city in the distance. That city combined architectures from so many eras that it was difficult to discern which era it belonged to. The buildings seemed to collide with each other and take on strange shapes. They seemed to have fallen from the sky and piled up in a surreal way, giving an image of unclassifiable modern antiquity. We saw, as we got closer, that this city was surrounded by a high stone wall, and there was only one entrance which we headed for. Along the way, we saw several dead people coming and going, some dragging carts covered with cloth so that the contents could not be seen. When we finally reached the entrance, a guard dressed in armor typical of the Middle Ages hailed us and urged us to identify ourselves. My partner explained that he was a cherub that accompanied me, while I explained my journey since he had died. The guard asked us as payment for something from the world of the living to be able to pass, which left me surprised. My companion, on the other hand, made metal ingots appear out of nowhere, which fell at the guard's feet. Seeing that we had complied, he let us pass, warning us, yes, that it could be dangerous for both of us. We appreciated his warning and entered the city. Just entering could be counted thousands of souls, each carrying out tasks typical of any great living city. There were patrols of soldiers dressed in various eras, and there was even a huge market. I noticed that there were soldiers leading several in chains and heading for a kind of castle that crowned the city, and that, for some reason, was not visible from the outside. We were approached by a young man who asked us to help him find his mother. He was clearly upset, and we ignored him. Apparently, that city was organized in a military way, almost in a medieval way. I didn't understand what a military force was needed for in a city of the dead, so I focused on touring the different parts of the city and the many strange buildings there, repeating the same errors. In an alley, I found a man who was reading a book. He seemed quite cultured, and I decided to say hello and ask him about the workings of the city. From what he told me, the city had been built thousands of years ago by some souls who did not give in to the wheel of samsara and established a system similar to the one they lived through in life. Over time, the city gained strength and influence, and it was easy to grow it to what it is today. Unfortunately, as tends to happen, a group appeared that did not accept living in death, as in life, and engaged in acts of sabotage, forcing the city to militarize. Those rebels roamed freely, and their goal was to exist without worries or established order, which I added was typical of anarchists. Not knowing the term, the man made me tell him the story, as it had happened for the last 700 years, which was a long and tedious explanation. When I finished, he explained to me that there were other cities around the Unworld organized in a similar way, but with mannerisms more typical of the culture of the deceased. Thus, this city was organized in a mixture of ancient Roman society, with the feudal regimes of the Middle Ages, while other cities were organized in the style of ancient Persia or ancient China. Some even functioned as they did in life thousands of years ago, being in some way immortal witnesses of already fallen civilizations like the Egyptian. He also explained to me that it was common for there to be fights over resources, since they were scarce, and search parties would go out for materials that came from the world of the living. Generally, those objects with a great emotional or spiritual attachment appeared and were destroyed. Another way the economy worked was with slavery, and even the conversion of souls. It was common for those too weak to survive, or those who could not bear existence as such, to be enslaved or turned into tools such as stones or weapons. There were forgers in charge of working those souls to give them an appearance of use. He also added that it was common to suffer storms from beings from the abyss. Some of them were souls that had been lost in the maelstrom of a world that had no logic in its existence, and had joined the ranks of demonic beings that besieged cities with the sole aim of destroying them. The origin of those beings was never known, but it was known that they must be much older than humans. He went on to explain that the cities communicated through devices made from human souls, and for trade and travel between them, it was common to use zeppelins. Previously, there was no choice but to do the exchanges on foot, but since the zeppelins were invented, and with the high rate of accidents they had, it was not difficult for them to appear in this world to be reused. After telling me all that I was able to get an idea that humanity continued with its old customs, and that despite that non-life and that non-earthly existence, it gave them a new opportunity. For some dark reason, perhaps the only way humanity had to survive was to repeat the roles of the past. I invited that man to eat and thanked him for his explanation of the world in which he found me now. The rebels. After all that experience, I bought groceries thanks to the help of the cherub, and we headed to the exit of the city. My new goal was to find the rebels and ask them about their anarchist zeal in a world so different from what we were used to. Luckily, it was not difficult to locate them. We saw in the distance how they robbed a wheelbarrow and were then chased by city guards. All we had to do was follow them from afar until we came to a cave where a few of those rebels were gathered. Their first reaction was hostile, but when they saw the cherub that was with me, they understood that our intentions were not bad, and they invited us inside. That cave was a mess, and it was obvious that everyone did what he could or wanted. Unlike the order of the city, this was really an anarchist commune. We share our groceries with them and sit down to talk. Their curiosity got the best of them, and they asked me the reason for my visit, to which I replied that I wanted to know more about their way of life. I also explained to them what my adventure had been, knowing the various underworlds that I was able to visit before arriving in this peculiar world of the dead. The rebels were fascinated by my stories, since they, for whatever reason, were already born in this world and were unaware of the existence of other worlds outside this one. I wondered how it was possible for someone to be born after death into this world without first having succumbed to the light or found himself in one of those tortuous underworlds he had visited. They told me that when they were alive they were against the established system, and some of them had died in horrible ways precisely because of their opposition to the systems in which they found themselves living since they were born. Having awakened or been born in this new world, they did not want to live the same again, so they joined forces to fight against the established power in the same way they did in life. As their means were inferior to those of the city, it was common for them to forge alliances with other rebel groups to achieve small objectives or even take over city outposts, if only to steal supplies. I found that very sad, because in my opinion it was easier, or at least it would have been if everyone had agreed to form a fairer system. It saddened me greatly that so many hardships had to be endured after death, instead of finding lasting peace. Death itself was a strange stage in which most of the time the non-vital choice did not even allow the use of free will. After sharing all that information between us, I decided to leave with the cherub to get out of this no-world in the middle of nowhere. The storm. We continued the same way we had come, since the cherub left a very faint but easily recognizable luminescent trail. Our goal was to get out of that world to return to nothingness, from where we would think about our next moves. We started the march and passed through that multi-age city again. We said goodbye to the guard at the entrance and returned following our steps. Halfway there, a terrible wind picked up. The smell was nauseating and electric. When I looked up, I saw in the distance that a kind of hurricane made up of lightning, greyish dust, and silhouettes of strange creatures was approaching the city. The cherub helped me to take refuge in the nearest forest. Those strange trees were creepy, but there was no choice but to hold on to them so as not to fly away. Being in a safe position, I could see how inside that strange hurricane there were a multitude of demonic and horrendous beings that gave off an anger and a desire for destruction like I had never perceived in anyone. The storm passed us by and rammed into the city. The hurricane broke up and all those creatures fell, which immediately began to fight against the residents of that city. A pitched battle was organized, of which he understood nothing. Could a dead man die? What happened to the dead who fell wounded and then died? Why did those beings yearn for the destruction of what had cost so many thousands of years to that dead humanity? So many unanswered questions. Back to nothing. When the storm ended, the fallen on both sides numbered in the thousands. The city had survived, and we were able to resume the march even without fully understanding what had happened. After hours of walking, we reached the edge of that strange world to return to stepping on a black and dark nothingness from where we had gone to the different underworlds. The cherub asked me what he thought about all that, and I told him honestly that he didn't know what to think. My impression was that free will was something false. We moved in life by moral codes that at death would be reason for judgment, to somehow have to start over. He still did not understand how it was possible for some souls to directly appear in that world of the dead without having the possibility of choosing, just as he did not understand why certain souls had to go through torture that could last thousands or millions of years to be cleansed. I told him that the best place was definitely nothing and his freedom of movement. There was no need to focus on anything else, and all the time in the world was available. While millions of souls were tortured in a strange repetition of life, others were tortured by third parties. Only a few could enjoy a well-deserved rest that was later taken from them to be reborn in lives that they did not choose, and if they did, it was impossible to determine the future due to strange contracts with third parties. Human existence was based on pain and suffering, even after death, so he did not understand anything of all that or what purpose it had. Where I felt most comfortable was in nothingness. The end of the journey. The cherub introduced himself a second time, this time to tell me that he wanted to know firsthand what impressions humans had of the soul triage system and the eternal cycle to which they were subjected. Rejecting the light did not make me special. I had simply been smart enough, he said, to delay the inevitable. For unless he reached nirvana, I would be forced to incarnate again. He had all the time in the world to reach that state of enlightenment, since I was in nothingness, or I could choose to go through one of those underworlds, go to the world of the dead, or let myself be carried away by the light. I couldn't think of anything better than to hug the cherub and thank him for the experience. For my part, the decision had been made, because he did not consider himself worthy of reaching nirvana, and none of those underworlds convinced me. Going into the light was not an option for me, since I didn't really know what was behind it. I made one last request to the cherub, that he give me water to drink from the Lethe River, to forget everything. The cherub gave me a hug with his strong wings, and when he finished, he made a glass of water appear, containing water from the river Lethe. I drank it and left my fate in his hands.